So the rise pretty much of the bureaucrats versus we the people. America was built with just three branches, not the four that we have now. Not some shadow government of agencies that we've never voted for. Just the three. You have the president who's supposed to enforce them, Congress to actually just write the laws, and the courts are the referee. Make sure everybody's not making a foul. And that's it. The founders lived under ministers and boards from London that issued rules nobody had voted on, and they swore it would never happen again. So Madison even warned us, men are not angels. Even Jefferson had warned us, liberty always yields when the government gains ground. And yet here we are, 90,000 pages of new rules a year, agencies writing definitions that change overnight, lives and livelihoods steered by people you can't fire. The founders didn't fear elections. They feared rulers that no one could hold accountable. That's the dangers we're standing in right now, people.
I have sworn on the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Rebellion to tyrants, obedience to God.
So the founders limited government vision. So the founders limited government vision. Welcome back to the Modern Patriot Podcast. I'm going to be your host still, John Tig Tigan. So this episode, I'm going to be tearing into the rise of the administrative state, the unelected bureaucrat fourth branch of government the founders never signed off on. We'll start with the founders' vision, the three branches, clear checks and balances, and power restrained by the people. Then obviously I'll move on to the, the New Deal, that cracked the door wide open, birthing the alphabet soup of agencies, writing rules with the force of law, which is illegal. And after that, obviously I'll hit on with the modern problem, overreach, weaponization of ATF, branches like that, changing definitions overnight, EPA grabbing land use, DOJ and FBI running double standard crap. Then it takes tip, the founders, gave us a republic. It didn't give us a self-growing swamp. Let's talk about how we got here and what's going on and what's going to take to push back. The Constitution names only three branches. Not a cabinet full of alphabet agencies. Only three: legislative to write the laws, executive to enforce the law, and the judicial to interpret the law. The founders built frictions into the machine so power would never pool into one place. James Madison said it straight in the Federalist 51. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. He added that we must oblige the government to control itself. I said that wrong, but that's what, that was not a theory to them. They knew it. It was muscle memory from living under the ministries and boards in London who wrote rules nobody voted for. Hell, they wrote rules and we never even saw them. They never saw them, I should say. Thomas Jefferson warned that the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. He wrote that in 1788, and he watched federal power take shape, I should say. Now zoom in on how lean early government was really back then, 1800s. The total federal government was roughly about, $11 million. That was our intake. Most federal revenue came from custom duties collected by a thin line of port officials. Civil service was tiny. About 3,000 employees across the whole government. We need to get back to that. The post office accounted for a huge share of them because obviously they had to deliver the mail. We're so spread out. The standing army, was kept intentionally small, for a reason. During the 1798 crisis with France, Congress authorized the provisional army, but almost no recruiting happened before it was even dissolved in the 1800s. But, even decades later, on the eve of the Mexican War, the regular army numbered only 7,300 men, protecting a nation close to 20 million. That was by design from our founding fathers. Suspicious of permanent national soldiery ran deep within our founders. The system of limits and localism had three big consequences. Law first, official second. Congress specified the rules, the executive carried them out, and courts referred, they took care of the conflicts. Accountability ran through elections. That's where we hold people accountable. So if Congress overreached, we could vote them out. If the president abused his power, Congress could impeach him, or we could throw him out the next term. Most, governing stayed close to home. That's local. That's towns, communities, counties, and state handled day-to-day life. Washington did customs. They, the post office, diplomacy, the defense of the nation. This is the world our founders built for us. But it required patience, debate, roll call, votes, and persuasion. It did not, assume expertise lived permanently in office. That's not what they wanted. It assumed freedom required friction. The founders did not fear elections. They feared a class of rulers nobody could fire. The shock is how close we now stand to that exact freaking outcome.
They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God.
And then we ran into the New Deal and the explosion of these freaking agencies. When the Great Depression hit, 1 in 4 Americans were out of work. So you kind of get anyway. So Franklin Roosevelt, he arrives and he's promising action. What followed was not just relief; it was a new way that we governed. Boards and bureaus writing binding codes, orders, and rules that looked and acted like laws. The county learned a new phrase in 1933, the alphabet agencies, from ATF, FBI, CIA, NSA, AAA, CCC, SEC, FDIC, all these other ones that were just kind of kept coming in. Some came by statute, some by executive order, to shape our lives. And they are. The National Recovery Administration, which is the NRA I'm actually talking about, under the National Industrial Recovery Act, industries were organized into codes of fair competition. So these codes set the prices, the wages, and practices across 500 plus industries, touching pretty much 22 million workers. So, you did not vote for a code authority. It was built inside the executive branch and published like law. I'm talking about business executive branch, not the president. So the Supreme Court did hit the brakes, and Schneider Poultry versus United States in 1935, the justice unanimously struck down Section 3 of the NIRA. Congress said, Congress, they said, had delegated legislative power without intelligible principle and pushed beyond the Commerce Clause. So the what they call it, the sick chicken case was a full stop, but the stop didn't last. Roosevelt answered with the Judicial Procedure Reform Bill of 1937, the famous court packing plan that added up to 6 new justices. So if you don't get what you want, force it in anyways. So the bill failed in Congress, but the pressure, coincide with the court upholding core New Deal pillars like the NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel, and retreating from the Lochner era limits, the Lochner, Lochner era limits. So the center of gravity moved toward acceptance of the board delegation and powerful agencies. So this is what that means today in practical terms. So there are 2 rivers of federal rules. You have the Federal Register is the daily flow of new proposed rules, final rules, notices, and guidance. In 2023, it ran 90,000 pages. And in some years, it was over 95,000 pages, that it output. Every page is a process and power. So the code of the federal regulation is stock of rules that are currently binding. In 2021, it totaled about 188,000 pages. That is in the law. That's 188,000 pages of law for our country. And it's a book. It's a law that we must follow. That's not to say all regulation is bad, but it's to say a huge share of what governs us does not come from a bill with names on a roll call. It comes from an office publishing text with legal effect. So when people say the administrative state, that's what they mean. Elected branches write broad commands, and then unelected officials fill in the detail that actually bind all of us. That dynamic is why the phrase non-delegation keeps reappearing and why courts have been recalibrating the boundaries. West Virginia versus the EPA, 2022, it was a coalition of states led by West Virginia challenged the EPA, you know, and what it was the EPA tried to use the Clean Air Act to force a nationwide shift in how electricity was generated, basically telling the power plants to shut down coal units and move to wind and solar. That wasn't in the text of law. That was the states said EPA was trying to make a major economic division that only Congress has the power to make. So what did the court decide? The Supreme Court agreed with the states. So that helped us. It said big economic or political it said big economic or political questions like changing the entire nation's power grid needed clear authorization from Congress. Agencies can't invent powers out of vague language, but they are trying. So that decision revived the major question doctrine. It's now the guardrail saying if agencies want to make a rule that reshapes an industry or affects millions of people, it must point to a clear law written by Congress. So that actually comes back and protects citizens from unelected bureaucrat assholes making national policy. Sackett versus EPA, 2023. So it was Michael and Cantel Sackett, an Idaho couple. So they bought a small lot near a lake and built a home. EPA stopped them, claiming their land contained waters from the United States of America, meaning it was under federal control because nearby wetlands. Bullshit. The Sackett faced heavy fines just for trying to build their own home on their own damn property. So the Supreme went all the way up to Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled for the Sacketts. It said EPA's definition of waters of the United States was way too broad. The court threw out the significant nexus test, which let EPA claim control if a wet patch might affect a distant stream, and said only wetlands with a continuous surface connection to for actual navigation of waters. So that decision shrunk the federal power, at least EPA's power, over our private lands and gave back our rights to our property. So EPA had to rewrite its rule to match the court standards. So again, EPA wrote their own damn rules. But for ordinary Americans like us, it means, we're less likely to need federal permission to dig a ditch or build on our own damn land. Looper Bright Enterprise versus Ramondo in 2024. I think I said that right, but it was a family-owned fishing company from New Jersey sued the United States Department of Commerce. So it was the federal regulators forced a small fishing boat to carry government-approved monitors on board and actually pay for them. So the law didn't clearly say fishermen had to foot the bill. So Looper Bright argued that agencies had been using Chevron defense to twist unclear laws however they wanted. So what the court decided, the Supreme Court agreed and overturned the Chevron rule. It's a 40-year-old rule that told judges to automatically defer to agencies' interpretations of vague laws. So the court said judges must now use independent judgment when reading statute. So that's massive. It ends decades of judicial rubber stamping agency power bullshit. Now when an agency tries to stretch a law, courts will decide what Congress actually meant, not what the damn bureaucrats meant. It shifts authority back to us, to the representatives, and the courts is where it belongs, but putting all that together, then you have the New Deal era from the 1930s. Let these federal agencies start writing the real rules that govern everyday life, everything from land use to energy to health. That's why our health system is so jacked up nowadays. These three modern rulings are, of course, a correction, but they don't kill regulations, but they draw hard lines around who gets to decide what the law says. So the West Virginia EPA said Congress, not agency, makes the big policy calls. Sackett versus EPA pretty much said the property owners, not the bureaucrats, define the limits of land use. Congress, clearly says otherwise, unless Congress clearly says otherwise. The Looper Bright and Ramondo said, courts, not agencies, get the final word on what a law means. So, these cases collectively pull power out from unelected bureaucrat bullshit hands and returns it back to elected ones and us, because that means fewer surprise rules changes, clearer laws, and more accountability. For the political class, it means they can't hide behind the agencies as much. they got to pass on real laws, and now they got to own the consequences. So the Justice Department and FBI trust gaps, so it's insane. I mean, I'm reading all this stuff, trying to figure out what to kind of put out there. There's so much information on this, but, the Justice Department and FBI, the trust gaps, it explains simply, the Department of Justice, DOJ, and the FBI are supposed to enforce the laws and protect Americans, right? But lately, they're making huge, I don't even say mistakes, but it's things that make people wonder if politics or bias are creeping in where justice is supposed to be blind, So here's what's actually happened and why it matters. The FISA warrant problems. 2019-2020, the FBI used a secret court called the FISA court to spy on people suspected of being foreign agents. That's what it's supposed to do, right? But the DOJ Inspector General, kind of like the department's internal watchdog, found that the FBI messed up those applications. They left out facts, used bad information, and broke their own damn rules. That wasn't a rumor on social media. It was proven in official reports. But, it didn't. The good news is it forced changes to how surveillance warrants are reviewed, supposedly. But the bad news, it made Americans question if the system could be ever trusted again. To me, once you break that trust, you're never going to get it back. Then you have the Catholic Memo 2023. An FBI field office wrote a memo suggesting agents keep an eye on so-called radical traditional Catholics. Basically, it treated some church-going Americans as potential threats. When that memo leaked, people were outraged, and rightly so. But anyways, so the FBI quickly pulled it back, but the damage has already been done. The truth was out there. People started asking if they're labeling Catholics like that, who's next? We know they did it to the parents going to school boards, but it showed how easily government tools meant for safety can turn everyday citizens into criminals. They're being turned against us. The school board memo 2021, during the pandemic, parents across the country spoke out at school board meetings about the mask, lessons, policies, grooming. Some got loud, some got angry. A group representing school boards wrote to the DOJ asking for help against threats. The DOJ sent a memo saying it would look into serious threats, but many people, thought it meant they'd investigate parents for speaking up, and they did. The group later apologized for exaggerating, but the whole thing made families feel watched just for speaking their mind. That's what this fucking nation was built on. But that's a big problem in a free country. Each of these moments chip away at public trust. The DOJ, FBI, CIA have a huge power in this nation. But when they act without clear limits, throw NSA in there as well. When they act without clear limits, people stop believing they're fair. They stop trusting them. An ounce of trust that breaks, it's hard to rebuild it. So the real problem underneath it all, there are three big reasons this keeps happening. The vague laws. Congress writes big open-ended laws and lets these jackass agency bureaucrats fill in the details. Those details turn into rules that affect your job, your property, your freedom, your money, our livelihood. It's all written by people we never voted for. There's no freaking accountability. You can vote out a senator or a representative, but you can't vote out a lawyer in freaking DC office who just changed the definition of a freaking firearm or a wetland. Courts used to look the other way. For 40-something years, judges followed something called the Chevron deference, which meant they usually took the agency's word over the vague law. That actually ended with the Looper Bright versus, the Raidman in 2024, which, again, that was huge. So now judges must read the law, do their damn job themselves, and decide what it actually says. So, but that change doesn't kill regulation. It just forces it to follow the law, the word for word. The modern overreach and weaponization isn't theory. This is what overreach looks like on the ground. Bump stocks, 2018, ATF redefined bump stocks rifles as machine guns. Garland versus Cargill, 2024, Supreme Court said that's illegal. Only Congress can make that call, which we know that. Well, at least I do. It resorted, legislative accountability, but it leaves a policy gap Congress may never fill, meaning regulation can swing back and forth each administration. That's the freaking problem. Frames and receivers in 2022, ATF expanded what counts as a firearm under its ghost gun rule. Courts have split on whether that's legal. For gun owners and dealers, the definition of legal changed multiple times in a year, multiple times. That's what moving sand looks like. When words get weaponized, that's what it does. Land and water. After the Sackett and EPA after the Sackett case, EPA had to rewrite its water of the United States rule, removing vague terms and limits, that it came up with, but I mean, that's a win for us as landowners, but it also means more environmental authority shifts to the states, creating patchwork enforcement. DOJ and FBI. The DOJ Inspector General found serious FISA warrant abuse in 2019 and 2020. A lot of us know about this. Some probably still don't. But an FBI memo in 2023 labeled some radical traditional Catholics as potential extremists, which I talked about earlier, then had to be withdrawn. The DOJ in 2021 memo about threats to school officials sparked fears. It was chilling our free speech at school boards. Each incident chips away at public trust. So the real problem isn't one agency or one memo. It's the system as a whole that lets unelected assholes reinterpret laws, target us without direct accountability. Where the courts are now, they're getting better, but it's, again, the EPA, like the nation it's like the nation's environmental referee. Its job is to keep the air and water clean. But a few years ago, the EPA decided it could tell every power plant in America how to make electricity, basically forcing the whole country to switch from coal to wind overnight. Good thing the Supreme Court said, hold on, that's way too big of a decision for an agency to make on its own. If the government wants to change how the whole country makes power, Congress, the people we vote in, has to say so clearly in a law. It stopped the unelected officials from making gigantic economic decisions without permission. It told them, read the damn law and know what it actually says, not what you wish it said. In the Sackett versus EPA, Michael and Cantle Sackett just wanted to build a house for their small Idaho land. It was in Idaho. EPA told them you couldn't do it because their land might be a wetland, even though it was dry as most of the time, nowhere there was a river or a lake, but obviously the good thing the Supreme Court looked at it and said, this is stupid. You guys are nuts. You're crazy. They ruled the EPA can only control wetlands that are directly connected to real bodies of water like lakes, rivers, and streams. The Sacketts finally got to build their home, and the court made sure property owners everywhere aren't fined or stopped for using their land just because of a puddle or a ditch. Again, the Looper Bright Raimondo one, that one started this one started with the small fishing boats in New Jersey. The court said, the government said fishermen had to let federal monitoring ride along on every trip and pay that person's salary themselves. The fishing family said, where in the law does it say we have to pay for that? The government pointed to a vague sentence that didn't really say it. And the lower court sided with the agency because of an old rule called the Chevron difference. Basically meant if a law is unclear, we will trust the agency. The Supreme Court ended that bullshit. They said no more automatic trust. Judges must do their job. They must read the law for themselves and decide what it really means. It stopped agencies from twisting unclear words into new powers. Now, when a rule sounds fishy, courts have to check that text instead of rubber stamping it. What does this all mean for us? These three rulings work together like this. Congress makes the big calls. Agencies can't invent new powers, even though they still do. Property rights are clear. Still don't really own your property, but the government can't treat your backyard like it's federal land. So judges keep agencies honest. The courts now have to read the laws themselves instead of just believing the bureaucrat agency's version. So the Supreme Court reminded Washington that their power has limits, and those limits protect ordinary Americans. So together, these cases start, they start putting the brakes on runaway rulemaking. So when we elect the lawmakers, to write the law, if they hand their pens to permanent offices, self-government shrinks. The courts are forcing the pens back into the elected hands. And we should too. We really should. So here's a little practical patriot skills for the week that you can do. This is how you can help push back. You don't need a badge or a title to fight back. You just need to know where to aim your effort. So here's how ordinary citizens can start turning the tide against this runaway bureaucracy bullshit. One, know who's making the rules. Most people complain about laws, but never look at who actually wrote the rule that hit them. Go to the federalregister.gov, or regulations.gov. Those are the public sites where new government rules are posted. Again, not over 90,000 a year, people. So search for any rule connected to your work, your land, your firearms, your small business, your rights. Read the summary section. It sorts and tells you who's behind it. You can't fight what you don't understand. Start knowing who's pulling the strings. They're not going to tell us. So hit back. So two, hit back in the comment period. So when agencies want to make a new rule, they have to open it for public comment. It's hard to find them when they're doing it, but they must read and respond to every serious one. So be serious and respond to it. Don't be a smart ass. They'll just throw it out. So write a short, respectful comment. Quote the law and the rule. Quote the law, the rule comes from, and ask, where exactly does Congress give you this power? Remember that. Where exactly does Congress give you this power? Use real numbers if you can. This costs me X dollars, or this affects Y jobs. So the X, Y, and Z stuff. So thousands of thoughtful comments on the record slow bad rules down, or kills them all together. Bureaucrats hate the sunlight, so expose them. Build pressure locally. If the Supreme Court says this is not a federal issue anymore, it usually falls back to our state legislator, your county commissioner, or your water board. Depends on what it is. So that's where you can actually show up and be heard. Find your local representative and their public meetings. Bring others. Small groups make big noise. Don't be violent like the left. When everyone stays home, can stand up. Show facts, not anger. Angry people get ignorant. Informed citizens change the votes. The fight for freedom is fought in town halls, not just in D.C. So get organized, don't isolate yourself. Join a form of citizen networks around a single issue. Pick one, pick them all. I don't care. Property rights, gun rights, small business rights, parental rights, whatever rights your lane is. Meet monthly, share updates, divide the task. That helps even out the load so you don't feel overwhelmed. Track every proposed rule that affects your issue that you're focusing on. Every member takes one rule and follows it. When 5 informed citizens speak with the same facts, you look like an army. So keep your representatives accountable. Every bad rule started with the vague law that Congress wrote and walked away from. Call or email your representative once a month. Ask, will you vote to rein in an agency's power? Keep a record of who answers and who does it and how. They need to know we're watching them now. They need to feel the pressure. Politicians move when voters make noise in numbers. Use your rights the right way. When government oversteps, document it. Keep written copies of letters, permits, and contacts. If you're questioned or inspected, stay calm, polite, and firm. Ask for names and written authority. Record dates and details. Facts win battles. Emotions will lose them. And teach it forward. Share what you learn with your kids. Not like what our parents did. Your church group, or your shooting range buddies. Explain what these court cases mean in plain English. Make it simple. Don't need to make it more difficult. I'm thinking for another word, but anyways, just don't make it hard. Make it simple so a kid can actually understand it. The more people understand, the less room there is for bureaucrats to hide behind this stupid confusion. So freedom doesn't protect itself. It depends on us, the citizens, who know the rules, speak up, and refuse to bow or take a knee. You don't have to break anything to fight back. You just have to show up. Stay smart, stay loud, and be there when it counts. That's it. So I'm going to jump right into the TIG's tips. It's a live fire plan, so don't do this in your house. It's going to help increase speed without losing your accuracy. So if you want one live fire drill that pushes both speed and accuracy, I think I did cover it, but I'm going to do it again. The build drill, I think it was El Presidente. I think I might've did, but I didn't feel like going back and looking, but it's the build drill. So it's 6 rounds, 1 target, all from the draw. So it looks simple, but it reveals everything about your grip, your sight picture, your trigger control, and your recovery. Run this regularly and you'll see measurable gains in how fast you can deliver accurate hits. So obviously your firearm, your carry pistol, with a reliable holster, ensure retention and consistent draw. Obviously you're going to need ammo. Your targets, You can use an IPSC, IDPA, torso, or silhouette with a scoring zone like an ACB scoring zone, or a standard IDPA target. Your gun range will have it. You can look it up. So for build drill use a single target. The El Presidente one, it's going to be 3 targets. But anyways, so the distance for the build drill is typically going to be at 7 yards, but you can scale this. Again, just pick your poison. Your goal, it's going to be the standard progression. So what this is going to train is going to train your draw, your presentation, your first shot accuracy, rapid follow-ups, and your recoil control. So your draw, and you're going to fire 6 rounds into the A zone as fast and as accurately as you possibly can. So here's a little baseline distance for beginners, 3 to 5 yards. Obviously you're going to be holstered, strong side, hand on the holster, so you can be consistent. You're going to execute the draw, present, and shoot 6 rounds at the target and do it continuous and controlled. Your goal for week 1, all 6 in the A zone. Time, don't pry towards the time. Focus on smooth mechanics. And the time is just there to kind of pressure you, to put just put the pressure on, to put the stress on. So, your progression, 2 to 8 weeks, week 1, mechanics, 3 sets, 4 reps, dry fire, draw, present, trigger, 6 live fire reps, 3 to 5 yards, slow and controlled. Try to rest between. You don't need to go really fast. Do like a 1.5 reps in between. So week 2, a little more of a tempo, 4 sets, 6 reps, live fire, 5 yards. So your time shots, record per run time. Aim for consistent grouping before trimming your time. Week 3, try to tighten up your first shot. Use a single shot draw. So draw, 1 shot, holster. Do 6 reps. Built that sight acquisition. Week 4, speed push. So do 6 runs, build drill at 7 yards, track your time. Hopefully A zone hits, reduce time by 5 to 10% each week, while again, keeping at least 4 to 6 a hit. So 4 to 6 A hits. So the A box. Week 5, complexity. So add weak side reloads or one-handed follow-ups after 3 shots. Mix in strong weak hand draws, to build robustness. Have measurable, benchmarks. Here's a few examples. Defensive baseline, 6 for 6 A zone at 7 yards within 2.5 to 3 seconds. Top tier competitive times are faster, but this is a practical drill. This is just to help you get better. Log percentage A zone, log what you're doing in your A zones plus time. Increase speed only when your accuracy in the A zone box, I would say 85%. You can do 90, you can even do 100% before you increase. That's fine, but I would not increase your time, your speed, unless you're at least 85%. So smooth draw, smooth draw stroke, your thumb forward on the grip pushes the gun up to your line. Do not muscle the sight. Let the recoil recovery happen with proper grip and trigger control. So, just do what you can. Sources and standards for the build drill practice, they're listed all over in trading lectures. You can look it up. It's how to increase your speed without destroying accuracy. Train slow, go fast. Tight group first. If groups open when you speed up, stop and rebuild. Fundamentals will win the fight. Okay. Dot torture, controlled fire drills are great for this. Measure everything. Time each run, record hits. Improvement is only visible when tracked. Don't try to memorize it. Write it down. Isolate your weak links. Is your first, if your first shot is slow during a single shot draw, if your reload is slow, do magazine changes. Just pick up those drills, smooth them out. Use interval training. Work to rest ratio. High intensity, 20, 30 seconds. For 1 full run, rest 90 to 120 seconds. Just like working out, repeat 4 to 6 times. Short reps train speed. Rest prevents sloppiness. That's why you want to rest. That's why even when you're working out, doing any other drill, you rest. So dry fire, it supplements 80% of improvement. 80% of improvement comes from the dry fire practice of a draw. It really does. So, do the draw, trigger, reload mechanics. Live fire will then cement it in. Grip and stance, strong 2-handed thumbs, forward grip, stack your thumbs, slightly forward leaning stance, active support, hand pressure to control muzzle flip. Train this as a reflex. recoil management drills, controlled double tap strings with focus on front sight reacquisition between shots. Try to find that sight. So, keep your pre-shot routine simple. Sight focus, smooth press, recovery, under stress, keep the checklist tiny. Don't overdo it. The build drill will humble you, but it will also sharpen you. Run it, record it, repeat it. Over time, you'll shave tenths, even maybe seconds off your draw, controlled recoil, like it's second nature. Build the confidence that when it matters, your rounds will hit fast and hit true. So again, just kind of keep that, keep going with that stuff. So, the founders never promised us an easy road. They promised a framework, but it's on us to guard it. So it's the same with when you're training. No one's going to hand you the speed, accuracy, or discipline. You're going to have to earn it through repetition, by showing up, by refusing to quit. Even when it feels slow, you feel down, it goes the same thing. When we don't do anything, if we don't practice ourselves with other things, the government, the bureaucracy is going to grow. It's going to grow, because we're going to get lazy, like we have been lazy. Liberty only survives when people stay engaged. So keep moving, keep training, keep holding the line. So I got a scripture, kind of goes with everything. So Galatians, hopefully I said that right, 5:1. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. So that verse isn't just spiritual, people. It's practical. Freedom once lost is rarely returned without a struggle or bloodshed. Standing firm is both faith and action. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for the gift of freedom and the wisdom of those who built this nation. Give us courage to resist control, discipline to live with integrity, and the strength to stand firm when it's easy to give ground. Bless the listeners and their families with clarity and protection. In Jesus' name, amen. So this has been the Modern Patriot Podcast. I'm your host, John Tig Tigan. Never let a lie go unchallenged and always move forward.
Brothers met was on opposite